Although I'm not entirely sure if this is how I discovered this game, I do remember there was one time when we were at a shop, I believe it was Woolworths, this being the Woolworths that I had previously got Pokemon Red and Link's Awakening from. It may have been that place, I don't know, but I remember seeing a sort of little piece of card which had the characters from this game on it, and I also remember there was a TV show on Channel 4 called Thumb Bandits where they would talk about different games coming out, and I remember they mentioned this game and I was quite amazed to see it. But one day when it was my friend Bridges' birthday, he had just turned 12 years old, I believe. I was invited over to his house and I basically pestered him to show me this game because he had it and I really, really wanted it. And so he eventually did show me part of it and I was basically desperate to get it at this point. And I did. I remember at this point I was young enough to the point where I couldn't just go out and buy it. I actually saved up my money, which seems like a strange concept now, but I saved up my money for this very specific game and then I went and got it. I actually got it. I remember that very same day we went to my nana's house after only having played it for a very short amount of time and the whole time wanting to get back home to get back to playing it. And I played it and I completed it and I afterwards, still during the summer holidays, so we hadn't gone back to school yet, went over to Bridges' house and I told him that I had completed the game and he hadn't completed it at this point. So it's very strange that there's this game that I knew that he had it, I wanted it, and then when I had it, I didn't speak to him until I finished it, which is quite strange. But my seventh favourite game of all time is Final Fantasy X. And this became known for quite a few things at the time. For example, it was the first Final Fantasy game on the PlayStation 2. It was also the first Final Fantasy game with voice acting, and it also did a few things such as eliminating the world map, which a lot of people seem to think is a bad thing, but I don't know why. I think it's okay. I don't see an issue with it. Now, this game runs off what is called the CTB system, and that is just an abbreviation that they came up with, like ATB. Apart from, unlike ATB, when it gets to a character's turn, you can just leave it and not do anything. And so it is a lot closer to what would be considered pure turn-based. You have your line of characters and you have the enemies, and you can see in the top corner the turn order. But also you can see just how far away different characters' turns are from each other, and different actions that you do can affect the turn order, so certain types of commands will take a longer amount of time to recover from to get your turn. Which is basically that whole thing of all of your characters being on a charge bar and each character has their own speed, and then when they get to the top of the charge bar then they have their turn. It's basically that, but displayed in a more effective way, I suppose. This game also introduced the whole idea of being able to switch characters in the middle of battle, which at the time seemed like, oh wow, this new feature, but really what this tends to do is it tends to mess up with the experience distribution system, because each character gains a flat amount of AP, which is basically the experience of this game, and they gain it depending on whether or not they had a turn. So a lot of the time you'll be switching out a character to make them defend, and then switching out another character to make them defend, just to make sure that they take an action so that they get their AP. Levels are quite strange in this game because you don't have a strict level, but rather you have a sphere level, and these can be spent on the sphere grid. And the sphere grid is one of those things that people say it's rather complicated, but it really isn't. It's really, really simple. Every character starts on a specific point on the sphere grid, and you can spend your levels to move across the grid. If a character is on a particular node or adjacent to a node, you can use a sphere to activate it, and the red spheres will do that. So for example, an ability sphere will activate an ability so that that character will learn the ability as long as they are either next to or on that node on the sphere grid. And you also have different things with stats as well, so you might have power spheres that deal with physical strength and HP and all that. And then you've got the same for magic and agility. What does make this especially interesting though, I think, is just how you can get all these different types of spheres to interact with the board in some sort of way, and I realized I said board rather than grid, but whatever. For example, the light blue spheres will allow you to teleport your character around the grid to different positions. So you might have a friend sphere that will allow you to teleport to where another character is, or a return sphere which will allow you to teleport to any node that has an activated sphere on it. And then at the high end you've got like the warp spheres which just let you teleport to anywhere. There's the yellow spheres which will allow you to activate nodes from long distances based on what other characters have learned. So like a black magic sphere will allow a character to learn any of the black magic on the grid that any other character has learned. And the same goes for like white magic and skills and all of that. You also get spheres that you can use to activate different empty nodes so that you can put in a stat boost into it that you wouldn't be able to activate otherwise, but I will go into that later. The majority of this game, story-wise, is just going forward and taking part in the battles that you'll find along the way, and the sphere grid is pretty linear for the most part. Each character will have their own path, but there will be a few branches here and there, and you will be given a few different things to work with when it comes to like the yellow spheres and the light blue spheres, for example. Equipment in this game also doesn't have stats, it's how you have your passive abilities, and equipment can have up to 4 empty slots, or maybe it already has abilities on it, so it might have, for example, HP plus 10% and then 2 empty slots, making space for 3 abilities total, and you can fill in those empty slots with different items which will grant different passive abilities to the different equipment. Now the end game I think is where this game gets very interesting, because the way that I describe this game is that the main story is about the battling and the post game is about the leveling, because that's where the leveling system in the sphere grid gets really interesting, because all characters can eventually go out and unlock everything on the sphere grid. You'll need the appropriate keys and the levels or the spheres to get around to do all of that, but that becomes easy enough to do eventually anyway. But if we're dealing with super bosses, you will need to also have the right equipment, because you will need very powerful passive abilities in order to be able to survive, because you don't want to be wasting time manually doing things like reviving and hastening your characters. But the post-game leveling is very interesting, because at that point it gets to where you will not just be gaining levels to move around, you will have to start manipulating the grid yourself. See, there's this monster arena where you can capture monsters, and from that you can create these extra powerful enemies, and what those enemies will do, they will, aside from being very powerful, drop very, very nice items for you, such as the spheres that will put in stat boosts onto the grid where they are usually empty nodes. But also you gain the ability to buy clear spheres which will delete stat boosting nodes from the grid. So say you have a strength plus 2, you can delete that and then earn the strength sphere to input a strength plus 4, and then you can basically boost everyone's stats that way. But you will have to go around and reclaim them with each of the characters. So there is this element of having to temporarily weaken your characters in order to be able to get them stronger in the long run, which I think is just fantastic. It is absolute genius how the grid becomes something that you just use to get around and gain stats and abilities from, but it does eventually get to the point where you are trying to bend it and manipulate it to become as powerful as you can, and it is just fantastic. Now, of course, people who are familiar with this game would think that I should start talking about Blitzball and that. To be honest, I was never really into Blitzball at all. It's just something that I didn't really like. And the side quests and minigames in this game generally aren't very good. Like the dodging 200 lightning bolts one, I think people really overestimate that. It's nowhere near as hard or as tedious as people make it out to be. And they're really not a big deal. They are just little things that are on top of this fantastic game with such a very interesting leveling system, and I would guess that this is the most played game for me. I played this loads when it came out, I played this loads over the upcoming years afterwards. I remember towards the late 2000s I really got back into playing this and trying to max out my characters, and then there was the HD remaster on the PS3 which I did get the platinum for. I would say that I have played this game for close to about 1,000 hours now, total. So my story about this game is very special because I am willing to say that this is the most important game to me. Not my number one favorite game, but the single most important game in my development as a gamer, so to speak. Because my friend Matthew used to every so often show me games that he knew and he had, but I didn't know about. And most of the time I would see it and I would want the game. And I was never really prepared to want the game before he showed me it. But this game in particular, he brought it over and he showed me it. And I was just absolutely blown away by it. He ended up doing a temporary trade. I let him borrow one of my games for a while and I borrowed this game. But the problem was that this game that I borrowed from him didn't really work very well. It crashed at a certain point, so I was only able to play a very limited amount. But even within that very limited amount, I just kept on playing, and I absolutely loved it. My sixth favourite game of all time is Final Fantasy VIII. I cannot begin to tell you just how absolutely blown away I was when he first showed me this game. Bearing in mind that RPG-wise, all I was really familiar with was Pokemon. Outside of Pokemon, there wasn't really anything. And so I saw this game, and he was playing during the Nog sequence. Anyone who's played the game knows what the Nog sequence is. And I saw him running around, and he'd go into these battles, and there'd be like random battles, and you would take turn. You had your line of characters, and you had the enemies. And this to me was so advanced and so prominent, and it just struck me as the way of the future. Oh boy, I turned out wrong there, didn't I? But it just struck me as this is what games are going to be like in the future, because this is so advanced. I remember I would see him open the menu and just this huge list of stuff, or what seemed huge at the time, and he would go into different junctions and different GFs, and I was like, I don't understand any of this, but I wanted to learn because it looked so involving and so complex, and I didn't know what cards were. I thought cards were equal to the GFs because, again, I was thinking about Pokemon, and I was thinking, you use cards on monsters and they become your GF, which that was wrong. But I borrowed this game, and basically the game crashed once you left Balam Garden, and so I just spent hours upon hours in the training area fighting Grats over and over, building up levels and teaching my GFs all the different abilities that they could, of course only having access to Quetzalcoatl and Shiva at that point. But I still absolutely loved it. I actually borrowed this game over the course of us going on holiday to Mallorca. This was the second time we went to Mallorca. The first time we went to Mallorca I had a horrible sunburn and ended up shedding a layer of skin. Not that time, the time after. So this would have been around 2000. And when I got back, I played it some more, and I would ask him about how the different abilities work. And I was just blown away by it. But enough about all that, me being blown away about it and thinking that turn-based combat was going to be the way of the future. Let's talk about how the game works. Now, it's a very strange game in that leveling up is pointless. You want to avoid leveling up. And is this a flaw in the game's design? I would kind of say yes, but I would say that if you know about it, that doesn't make the game worse. It's if you don't know about it, it can screw you over quite a bit. But if you know about it, then you finding ways to get stronger and being able to overcome things becomes a much more interesting game. The reason you don't want to level up in this game is because the enemies level up as you do, and so when you grow and gain stats, your enemies grow and gain stats. But the reason why it's actually better to be at a low level is because when it comes to junctioning, which I will explain soon, the stats that you gain from that are a static increase. So for example, something might give you 1000 HP extra, but 1000 HP in a world where you and all of the enemies are at a low level is a better effect than getting 1000 HP in a world where you and all of the enemies are at a high level, because it's a higher relative boost. Basically, all of the characters in this game have very little when it comes to innate abilities. All they have is their limit breaks, which is a special unique attack to them that they can use when they are low on health. Aside from that, everything comes from the GFs, the Guardian Forces. You can get up to 16 GFs in this game, and each character can equip any amount of GFs at once, but each GF can only be equipped to one character at a time. And your characters gain access to the abilities that the GFs they have equipped have access to. So say for example you want to equip Squirrel with the HP plus 20% ability, you will have to give him a GF with the HP plus 20% ability so that he can equip that. And the general idea is that you want to prevent overlap. So say if you have two GFs with very similar abilities, you don't want to equip them both on the same character, because where the abilities overlap, say if for example they both have HP plus 20%, Squirrel is still only going to have access to HP plus 20% one time. But the way that the different abilities work from the GFs, you have the command abilities such as magic, item and all that. You have the junction abilities, which will allow that character to junction spells to their stats, which will increase them. So for example, if you have a GF with HPJ and you give that to Quistis for example, then Quistis can junction magic to her HP. So say if she has 100 cures, you can put those 100 cures onto her HP, and as a result of them being on there, her HP will increase. And the same goes for other stats as well, and this can also affect your status effect resistance and the additional status effect from your attack, as well as different elemental weaknesses and resistances as well. There is also the GF ability category, which is just abilities that will affect the GF itself, such as an increased amount of HP or the ability to boost it whilst you're summoning it. And you will have passive skills that you can equip to their extra passive ability slots, which each character starts with 2, but you can get an ability to learn the junction ability, ability times 3 or ability times 4, which will allow them to equip 3 or 4 of these passive skills, which is kind of like your HP plus 10% and all that. And then you also have the menu abilities, which is very interesting because a menu ability is something that you will just have access to from the menu at any time. And this is in most cases the refine abilities. Refine abilities basically allow you to turn things into other things, and this is one of the most effective ways of gaining magic in this game. One of the things that the game is hated for is the draw system, that being that there is a command ability called draw, where if you get a character to use draw on an enemy, you can gain some spells. And this is one way of gaining some spells to junction to your stats. Now, some people, for some reason, are under the impression that this is the best way to gain magic, which it absolutely is not. And so they are convinced that the game is all about going to all these different enemies and spamming draw on them over and over and over again, which it absolutely isn't. But of course, you will have bosses and stronger enemies that will have some pretty nice magic for you to draw from them, but of course the issue there is that they are going to be powerful, so you have to keep yourself alive, and you still want to win the fight in the end as well. But the refine abilities allow you to change items into other items, or change cards into items, or change items into magic, and this is very useful. It is actually through refining cards into items that you will get the best magic as early as possible, because there is a separate card game in this game called Triple Triad, where you build up a collection of cards, and the rule is that each card has its own strength on each one of its sides, and you take turns putting a card into this 3x3 grid, and if the card that you put down is touching a card that your enemy controls, then if the number on your side touching the number on their side is bigger, then you'll flip it to become your colour, and this is one way of gaining cards. But also there is a card command that you can turn the enemies into cards as well. And I find this a very interesting game, and it's a very neat way of building up resources. What's also interesting about all of these different refine abilities is that it is possible to get so many of these abilities that if you have a particular combination of like 5 or 6 of these, you can, although it takes a lot of work, just raise your character's stats on the spot, but it takes a lot of time and a lot of work, and it's a really obscure thing as well. So, for example, you will have abilities that will allow you to access shops from anywhere in the world, an ability that will make items cheaper, an ability that will increase the amount of items available in shops, and then you have to buy them and then refine them into other curative type items and then sell those at a particular place, and eventually learn the ability on the final GF, which will allow you to turn items into items that teach GF's abilities, and you can repeat this process to eventually get stat boosting items at a very slow rate. But it's very interesting, and I've got to say that I do absolutely love this game. This game means an awful lot to me, and it certainly has a special place in my heart. I would say that if this game didn't have a leveling system at all and just sort of stuck to the whole refining thing and junctioning, then it would generally be better, but as it stands, it still is a fantastic game, and I absolutely love it.